Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas, and join me as I talk to today's guest. Listeners, I'm delighted to be joined by Andrew Bryant today, and it's taken us quite a while to get this date in the diary. I think it's probably taken over a year, but I'm really pleased to be able to have this conversation with Andrew today. Andrew Bryant is the founder of Self-Leadership International and the world's leading expert on self-leadership. He's written a number of books on the topic: Self-Leadership, How to Become a More Successful, Efficient and Effective Leader from the Inside Out, and Self-Leadership, 12 Powerful Mindsets and Methods to Win in Life and Business. And now his latest book is the new leadership playbook, Being Human Whilst Delivering Accelerated Results. Andrew has coached hundreds of leaders and leadership teams to become the very best version of themselves and to scale their companies. He has international experience with clients in Asia, Australasia, the United States, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Wow, Andrew, you've certainly been around the globe. And I think if I'm right, you've not long just come back from the Middle East.
Well, Middle East actually was a couple of months ago. I just got back actually from Norway.
How was Norway?
Yes. Norway was wonderful. Yeah, it was my first time to Helsinki, and I always love going to a country for the first time. Just to check it out. Yes, I do get about a bit, but when I was growing up in England, that was not a compliment.
Indeed. One of the questions I was going to ask you was about the difference between self-leadership and self-awareness. So, as you know, my interest is self-aware leadership, and yours is self-leadership. There are definitely crossovers, but they are not the same things.
Well, the crossover is one of the pillars of self-leadership is self-awareness. So firstly, let's define self-leadership, as I did with Dr. Anna Kazan in our 2012 book. Self-leadership is the practice of intentionally influencing your thinking, feeling, and actions towards your objectives. So self-leadership is about agency, it's about ownership and accountability. To be an effective self-leader, and we all self-lead, it's just we don't always do it to the best of our abilities. To be a self-leader, we have to have self-awareness, self-regulation, which some people might call emotional intelligence, and self-learning, the ability to adapt and be agile to the world around us.
So when you are exploring different countries around the world, does this play out differently? Does it look different depending on your cultural stance?
It looks different because part of the self-awareness, of course, is awareness of self also gives us awareness of others and awareness of context. So self-leadership is context specific. Self-leadership in North Korea is going to be different from self-leadership in North Manchester or North Carolina. So we do need to be aware of the circumstances that we're in. And the thing about the self-awareness is it really pushes against so much of our programming. I mean, self-leadership only comes about when we have that epiphany, when we wake up, that we can be the driver of our life. Psychology clearly shows us that we don't have anywhere near as much free will as we think we have. We may even have no free will, because we don't choose our DNA, we don't choose our parents, we don't choose the place, time of our birth. We don't choose our childhood upbringing. But at some point in our life, we get this awareness, hang on a moment, I want to be the driver. I don't want to be reactive. I don't want to be blaming, complaining, and playing the victim. I want to make a difference, and I want to take that agency. And regardless of whether we do have any agency, whether we do have free will, the act of imagining that we have agency changes our life and the version of ourselves that we're going to become.
Explain the word agency to us a little bit more. I'm hearing more and more people using it, but I'm not sure whether in the UK we use it possibly not as frequently and maybe not in the same way.
Well, in the definition of self-leadership, I talk about intentionally influencing. So we all influence a situation. We walk into a room and we influence that room, right? But if you intentionally go into a room, so I'm a professional speaker, so I walk onto stages around the world. Now, some people are terrified. Well, in fact, the majority of people are terrified of public speaking. I actually like it. But when I'm preparing a speech, I'm also preparing my intentionality for that speech. How am I going to be when I step on stage? And what is the outcome I want for the audience? And because I have that intentionality in mind and on my heart, then that drives my behavior. And that is the agency. It is being the driver rather than passenger, being proactive rather than reactive. Does that help?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think that's a really helpful way of describing it, is how you choose to drive your behavior. If you think about your coaching work and you think about different leaders' behaviors, have you identified that self-awareness is something that people come to coaching with, or is it something that is uncovered through coaching? Where does self-awareness fit in that coaching journey of the people that you've worked with?
Well, I have a chemistry conversation with the people I coach, and I'm really asking them, did you choose me or was I chosen for you, right? So if an organization says, hey, you need to have some coaching with Andrew, then the whole setup is somewhat remedial. And they're like, well, who are you and why are you coaching me? But if they've sought me out, they've been proactive, they've engaged in some agency, then they're very much going to have some self-awareness. But, self-awareness is on a scale, right? So, right now I'm aware that I'm sitting in a chair and I'm speaking to you. And as vice versa, you would be aware of too. And our listeners and our viewers would be aware, oh, okay, I'm listening to this podcast. But the balcony view, which we talk about, is that step back perspective, is I can be aware of myself sitting in this chair talking to you. Typically, we use the example of, if you were at a high school dance and you're dancing with a partner, you're aware of your partner, you're aware of your own movement, and you're aware of the people immediately around you, but you've got a limited perspective. You're hearing the music, but you might not be able to see the band or the DJ. And you're unaware of what's happening on the edges of the dance floor. But if you zoom out and you're on the balcony of whatever venue that is and looking down at the dance floor, you're aware of yourself moving with your partner. And now you've got a bigger perspective. You can see the patterns of the movement of the dancers and the people standing at the bar and the people standing around the edge looking on, et cetera, et cetera. And now you can see the band. But we could zoom out another level. We could go to have the rafter view. And from the rafter view, you're looking down at the balcony and considering the biases with which you are even looking at yourself on the dance floor moving around. So there are levels of self-awareness. I'm aware of the immediate stimulus response and maybe the emotions I'm feeling, but am I aware of what's behind that? What is the patterns that I'm bringing? What is the history, the narrative that I'm bringing to this situation? What are my biases and my previous background driving to my reactivity or proactivity? So self-awareness, as you know, has a lot of depth.
Definitely. It's awareness of awareness. And sometimes you have to go to that third level, awareness of awareness of awareness.
Well, it keeps going on, right? I mean, eventually you get up to some sort of universal or God view. I love, that concept of, was it, I think it was December 24th, 1968 or 69, when Apollo 8 came around the moon. And we get that amazing photograph of Earthrise. We see the surface of the moon and we see the globe, rising on the horizon, hanging there in space. And the great mythologist Joseph Campbell said we should have all had an epiphany at this moment. For the first time in the history of man, we get the God's eye view. Every religion on the planet has an upward orientation to our deity. And suddenly we're looking down from that God perspective. And we should have realized, one planet, one tribe, one future. And yet if you turn on the news today, you're going to hear about more and more division. So we really haven't had that step back phase as a race or as a population of the planet.
So I guess the best that you can do is do that for yourself as an individual, support your team to do that. And if you have the opportunity to help your organization to do that.
Absolutely. Transformation starts with ourselves, right? If you want to change somebody else, change yourself. Yeah. And people notice. I mean, the moment you have some self-awareness and then you engage in some self-regulation, it's interesting how everything changes. One of the practical skills of self-leadership is executive presence. How do we turn up? Do we project gravitas and confidence and poise under pressure? And the moment you start feeling better about yourself as you step into that room, then the people react differently to you. And the movie Pretty Woman, when she goes into the expensive store on Rodeo Drive and doesn't get the reaction. And then the Richard Gere figure goes in and he gets the reaction. And then over time, she dresses well, the reactions change, right?
Yes, interesting. When you think about leaders and leadership, what are some of the techniques that we can draw on to really bolster our self-leadership and self-awareness within that?
Well, there are obviously many strategies, and I've been writing extensively about those. The number one technique that I would always prescribe to somebody in leadership is to start journaling. And I'm sure you probably give the same advice, is that the moment you write it down on a piece of paper, you immediately are one step back in terms of self-awareness, right? What is the narrative I have? This year, I gave up drinking alcohol. And immediately I gave up something is a negative narrative. So as I was writing that down, I go, I'm giving up. And how does that make me feel? It makes me feel like I'm giving something up. That's not a good feeling. But hang on a moment, what am I getting in return? Well, what I'm actually getting is better sleep. And I'm getting the weight loss that I was looking for. And with the weight loss, I, reduced some of the symptoms of alcohol, which for me was acid reflux, and I was taking medication. And so what I got back was not needing to take omeprazole and feeling better in myself. So hang on, I'm not giving anything up. I'm getting something back. And I learned that by journaling. And so, it's a self-coaching, self-transformation piece. So I recommend every leader, journals at least. Well, certainly they journal every day, but they should have an hour each week, no devices, and sit and think about who is it that I am becoming. So back to this point about agency and the possibility that we don't have as much free will as we think we have. The moment that we say, I'm going to be the driver of my life, we start becoming a better version of ourselves, or a more aware version, and if we are intentional about it, a better version. So I'm version 6.2 of myself, and I'm certainly a lot wiser than version 4.2, and hopefully a bit more compassionate than version 4.2, even though I have a lot less hair than version 4.2. And obviously in a few years, I'll be version 7.2. And I'm on a very clear and intentional path. Who do I want to become, and what's my legacy going to be when I'm version 7.2? And part of my choice to put alcohol behind me was that it didn't fit in the plan to be the energetic version I wanted to be at 7.2. Not that I'm judging, not that I'm proselytizing to anybody. I'm just sharing, a practical example of a change that I've recently made myself.
Interested in what you say about language. And I think when we use language in a different way and we have that self-talk, I think that does make a very big difference. And I think when you were talking about walking on the stage and how you talk to yourself about your confidence on a stage, that is about the language that you use to talk to yourself. How does language then fit into your view of self-leadership?
Well, self-leadership owes a lot to narrative therapy. And so we are metaphorical creatures, right? Human beings are meaning-making machines, right? We create meaning. This self-leadership owes a lot to logotherapy from Dr. Viktor Frankl, the Jewish prisoner of war, the doctor who noticed who survived and who didn't. And he had agency about how he felt about his captors, that they could hate him, but they couldn't make him hate them. And how he chose to have a positive outlook. And of course, he survived an almost unsurvivable experience. So, language is everything. So many people that you speak to are actually emotionally illiterate, right? You say, how are you feeling? And they go, okay, or I'm fine. You go, yeah, but how are you really feeling? And they struggle to articulate it. I remember when my kids were at kindergarten, they were coming home with little charts of I'm feeling happy, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling excited, or I'm feeling frustrated, or I'm feeling curious, or I'm feeling wonderful. And so one of the first things I do with senior executives is say, well, how are you feeling? And if they can't do it, there's a wonderful, colorful diagram. Just Google emotional wheel, and I think you'll find it. And there's hundreds of words that we can use to describe how we feel. And as an exercise, say, well, how do I feel about this and actually being able to label it is incredibly powerful. The moment we label something, we have some power over it rather than it having power over us. I mean, this goes all the way back to the early alchemists, those guys trying to turn lead into gold. They believed that if you knew the true name of something, you could call upon it. Now, this is, witchcraft and wizardry, but that's all a spell is. I could tell somebody to, go jump in a lake, or I could wish them an incredibly focused and productive day. Now, imagine them saying, have a great day, but changing that to have a productive and focused day, have a joyful day. And suddenly your language has become a blessing to somebody else. It's become a spell.
And you definitely see how that links with journaling. So if you are putting your thoughts out, you're getting it from your head, you're putting it down on paper, you then have that distance and objectivity. You are able to view the language you're using, and you are able to make that choice about changing that language so that you operate in a more positive sphere, in a more productive sphere.
You make it sound like a lot of hard work when you label it out like that.
Okay.
So, and it is. And to be fair, it takes practice. As I said, I'm version 6.2, and I've been doing this for many, many years. But you get quicker at it, right? I remember writing down reframes. How do I feel about money? Money is the root of all evil. No, it's not. The love of money is the root of all evil. Money gives me choices, and writing hundreds and hundreds of lines about what my relationship with money is. And it's quite interesting. I had a call this morning with an entrepreneur who had built a very successful business and then brought in some new partners. And those partners had this lack and fear and anxiety. And he's like, it was really freaking him out because he had a very good relationship with money and abundance and, the fact that money goes in cycles. And he was having to deal with all this negativity. So you're absolutely right. It is a practice and it takes intentionality. But then my origins of self-leadership go back to, I started my career as a physiotherapist. And initially I was patching people up. And then I realized I didn't enjoy patching people up as much as I enjoyed preparing them for peak performance. And, in sport, you don't expect to be good if you don't put in the work. So, what's it worth to be the best version of yourself? Put in the effort.
Practice makes perfect.
Or perfect practice makes perfect, remember, because, if you practice a bad golf swing, you just get really good at a bad golf swing. So that you need around, what kind of practice it is, right?
Hey, that's good advice. Linking to our conversation about language, in one of your blog posts, you use the phrase constructive vulnerability. What does that mean for us? What is constructive vulnerability? We talk about being vulnerable in the world of work and being vulnerable as a leader, but what does constructive vulnerability mean to us?
Okay, so this is an example of getting good with language and the distinctions, right? So vulnerability is being aware of the threat or being aware of a weakness, and so that has negative connotations. However, when we're constructive, when we share with people, hey, look, I'm going to show you the mistakes I made and what I learned from that, then that's very powerful as a leader to engage other people. If you're setting up a frame that I'm perfect and you're not, that creates a barrier between the leader and the follower. And for me, leadership is measured by the changes in the followers, not in the traits of the leader. So constructive vulnerability is being intentional about revealing your vulnerability. I wrote a follow-up blog just this week, actually, about, is vulnerability the new social media superpower? And that was because I was seeing vulnerability somewhat overused, right? And in speaking, we have a little phrase, share your scars, not your scabs. If it still bleeds, keep it to yourself. And so the scars that we have, if we share, how do we get those scars and what we learn from those? We've done the process, right? We don't want to be doing therapy in public. We want to have done our therapy in private, but then when we've had our victory, sharing that victory with other people is constructive vulnerability.
That's very helpful in terms of phrasing it that way. And I think it comes back to what we talked about initially around agency. It's about making that very clear choice about what you are sharing and the appropriateness of that. And I think as a leader, If you are modeling behavior, you're modeling language, you're modeling that positivity and that sharing at the same time.
Yeah, I think we should share vulnerability on social media once we've done it. All right. Vulnerable posts certainly get lots of traction. In 2021, I had a possible cancer diagnosis and I had major abdominal surgery. And when it was all over, and only when it was all over and I was in the healing phase, I wrote a blog about what did I learn about going through the process. That got thousands and thousands of views, and I got lots of comments on that. And it was really helpful to get a window into, how did I face the fear? How did I build a network around me to support me? And how did I stay positive and yet realistic?
And we're very glad you're better and you're so.
Oh, well, I'm my wife is particularly glad that I came out the other side about that. So I'm very, very happy about that. Yes.
Indeed. I'm interested in groupthink and cognitive diversity, and I've heard you talk about leadership being as a result of a shared psychology or group psychology, and I'm interested to know more about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, leadership is a group process. It is, the leader is engaging the followers to move towards an objective, and it's usually a shared objective. Otherwise, it's management or it's coercion. So the leader says, let's go here. And that's in line with the values and the objectives of the followers. And so therefore it is a group activity, as opposed to groupthink, which is everybody thinks it's a good idea and they're not using the critical thinking to say, but is it the best idea, right? Or is it even a good idea? We're just all doing it. So the group dynamics here is, I believe that a good leader sets out that vision, that objective, engages the followers, and at the same time encourages the self-leadership to say, is this the best way to do it? Is to encourage their critical thinking. So many people are just following a football team or a political party or a religion just out of the fact that that's what they were born into, and there was no critical thinking about, well, what are the values of this political association? Is that what I believe in? Are they doing the best? How much agency do I have over my political or religious or cultural process? Do I have? And as uncomfortable it is as a leader, having people push back and say, yeah, can you explain that to us a bit more? Or, can we offer an alternative way? Is really the evolution of a leader. And I've been the president of 2 associations in my lifetime. And when you're leading volunteers, you really know whether you've got any leadership skills or not, because they'll tell you if you're not doing it right.
Absolutely. So if we think about self-awareness and self-leadership, how does that really help us navigate the challenges that we are facing and as leaders when we're thinking about their physical, social, emotional, mental health? How do we really draw on that agency to make sure that we are putting ourselves as leaders into a good position to be able to lead well and lead well for ourselves?
I think you almost answered the question as you asked the question, is that there is a responsibility as a leader to role model that which you want, right? So if you haven't thought about being a well-rounded leader, if you're only thinking about the objectives and not thinking about the people getting to the end and being able to do the next thing. I mean, if you were a rugby coach and you pushed your players to win at all costs, but you had 11 men down with injuries at the end of that game, then you're not sustainable for the season. I'm using a sporting metaphor. The leaders today are aware that they need to have focus, they need to have relaxation, they need to not be reactive, they need to be able to have the time to step back and have critical thinking themselves, and they want followers to do the same. Now, the challenge is, we still operate from paradigms of drive the results, drive the results, drive the results. And as leaders, if we don't deliver those results, perhaps our tenure might be limited. But if we deliver those results at the cost of ourselves, our own health and sanity, and the health and sanity of the people that we are leading, then that's irresponsible. It's non-sustainable. And we've seen the great resignation of people who say, you know what, this isn't worth it. I'm not following this. This doesn't make sense. And the pandemic opened that up to us, to the fact that, the way workplaces were set up were not healthy.
I'm wondering, as you were talking there, I'm wondering, are there some leaders who might use self-leadership in a more self-centered, selfish way, that if they take some of those, the foundations of that, and they make those choices for themselves and they are not behaving ethically, is that something that you've seen, or do you find that there are people are ethically and morally able to make those decisions and generally use it in a healthy way?
With great power comes great responsibility, said Peter Parker's uncle. And, there is always the possibility for misusing. But as you know, with self-awareness, as we build our self-awareness, we also increase our other awareness. So self-leadership is not selfish. Egotism is not the same as having a strong ego. In self-leadership, we develop a strong ego, a strong sense of self. This is who I am. This is what I value. This is what my intentionality. And this makes us less needy for in fact, if you do it properly, you're not needy at all for any external validation or power with that. So the self-leader, and we talked about the vulnerability, is actually able to influence with less use of formal power. They are attractive to people, and because they've got self-awareness, they know what's important to them. And so typically that comes with some level of moral code and ethics, because the self-learning is, if I do something unethical, I'm going to be aware of the ramifications of that and then fix it. Guilt is not a negative emotion, which most people are surprised about, but guilt says, I'm aware that there is a standard and I fell below that standard, whether that's a standard I put upon myself or a standard from society, and then I will close that. We know that a psychopath and a sociopath don't have that. They don't have guilt. And so they're able to do terrible things. So it is true that psychopaths, narcissists get to the top of organizations and political structures and do manipulate and do hurt people. I'm sorry, that is a reality. I would argue that they don't have self-leadership because their self-awareness is that they're buying into a narrative that they are more important than other people. And the reality is that it doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how much influence you have. You want a better human being than anybody else. You're better at something. You're better at making money, or you're better at throwing a ball or hitting a ball with a bat, but it doesn't make you a better human being. And I think that fundamental sense that nobody's better than anybody else as a human being, clearly some people are better than others at human doing.
Which leads me very nicely on to a question that I've asked many podcast guests. And it's this question about, do you think that leaders at the strategic level of organizations have greater self-awareness than leaders at other levels of organization? And I will ask this question because in the research, the answer is yes. What I discovered that the answer was no. So I'm really interested in hearing from my podcast guests. What have you discovered?
Yeah. Well, it's a bell curve, right? I mean, I have met people who've got to the very top of organizations and they clearly have no idea, but they've managed to be successful in a particular way. I mean, we promote people driving results, and that promotion of people driving results can lead them to say, well, I got the results, therefore my way is the right way, therefore everybody should do it my way. Great salespeople don't necessarily make great sales leaders because they've worked out a way to do it, but it's not necessarily duplicatable. Typically, the leaders that I have worked with, I mean, I've met some amazing people with tremendous self-awareness and self-regulation, to the point I'm impressed about how they manage their time, their lives, their social lives, and the values that they put around that. I've been very impressed by some of the people I've coached. It's an advantage of working at the pointy end of humanity that I get to see what is possible. And I say, well, thank you very much. I'm going to borrow that, or I'm going to take that as mine because now I've seen it, I can use it, right? So I don't have the numbers for you. I would say typically the people I work with, and if they don't have the self-awareness, I don't work with them for very long, right? They'll either fire me or I'll fire myself from that engagement.
And is that something that have you had a particular instance where when you're talking about that you're thinking about, are you going back to a particular type of organization that you can say, this was one of those instances where this really was not happening. I was not seeing any self-awareness, and I had to make that decision to move on, move elsewhere?
Last year, I parted ways with somebody I'd coached for a long time. And it was very painful because this individual had and still does have great self-awareness and had done some amazing things. And in our conversation way back when, I'd been empowered by him to say, look, if I step out of line, you have permission to call me on it. Well, he was going through a particularly tough time, and I observed that his leadership was kind of taking a backslide. And I called him on it, and I really called him on it on the wrong day, because it clearly was taking a backslide. And, that what he felt was criticism from somebody he trusted was just too much. And he said, I'm going to take a break, and we've not re-engaged to this point. It might change. I know I did the right thing, because I think that would have jolted him to go, okay, well, I hate Andrew, but I'm going to course correct. And, if I was the sacrificial lamb in that process, then I'm happy I did my role. And I would call it out again, because, that was the frame of our contract. And that, I think, is what makes me a good coach, is that I don't put up with anything. I call it. I'm not worried about, well, that's the end of that that paycheck from that client. I'm operating at a higher level than that and going, am I being the best person for this individual, challenging them to be the best leader that they can be? And that's made very clearly at the early part of our conversations. On my LinkedIn profile, it says a catalyst for change. And, a catalyst raises the heat generally of the chemical reaction. So if that's not what you're looking for, then don't engage me.
What are your thoughts about receiving feedback? Because receiving feedback can be tough. And I think when you're having positive feedback, it's great to hear. But then sometimes if you really want to change, if you want to have somebody who's going to be that catalyst for change for you, what are your thoughts on guiding somebody to receive feedback and receive it well?
Well, in the New Leadership Playbook, there's a whole chapter on feedback, and I use an acronym, FIF, Fact, Impact, Future. What is the fact of the situation? What are we getting feedback on? What's the actual behavior? What is the impact of that behavior, and what do we want to do differently? So if I'm giving feedback, I'll say, hey, this is what I'm observing. Do you observe this too? Just making sure we're both on the same page. What do you think the impact of that behavior is? And they will say, well, okay, now I'm getting some awareness. What do you want to do different in the future? Receiving feedback is exactly the same. When somebody's giving you feedback, you need to check, in what context are you giving me this feedback, right? Because feedback has to be feedback, not criticism, judgment, or opinion, right? Yeah. So, okay, in what circumstance did you observe this? Okay. What was the impact of my behavior? Is this your hallucination, or was there actually consequences to that? Okay, was that impact in line with my objectives? Probably not. Okay, what can I do in the future to improve this, right? So again, if I'm receiving feedback, I want to be into agency. Marshall Goldsmith, who wrote the book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, talks about feed forward, and that is the proactive reaching out for feedback. And I think it's important that you have people around you that you can reach out and say, well, okay, how am I doing on this? How could I do this better? And you've given them permission to speak into your life. So the reason we don't take feedback well is when we feel it's an attack to our identity. And, well, hang on, you're saying I'm not okay. And then maybe your self-esteem is not as well as it should be. And if your self-esteem is healthy, it means you know that you as a human being are valuable, but there's always room for improvement for your behaviors. So my behaviors are not who I am. I can change my behaviors. I can give a speech and it didn't work very well, and I can go, okay, what do I learn from that? What am I going to do differently? Right? That actually makes me a better human being. That doesn't make me a lesser human being.
I tend to say hard on the facts and soft on the people. And I think that's very similar to what you're saying. Let's not say that individuals are not capable, not confident, not good human beings. That maybe it was this particular instance where they could have done something differently, and maybe they can make that choice next time.
Yep. And people will not always appreciate you for giving the feedback in the moment, but if you do it well, they'll appreciate you long term.
Yes, I agree. You talk about AI tools like ChatGPT and how they can really facilitate self-reflection and enhance self-awareness. And I'm really interested to hear more about your advice on how listeners can do that.
Okay, well, so back to our conversation on languaging, I think artificial intelligence is misnamed. So if you reframe it to augmented intelligence, you'll have a better relationship with you.
Description. Yeah.
Yeah. So because, ChatGPT is, what did it do? It scraped the internet for all of the information. So it's the sum of, or an approximate sum of human knowledge to date, right? In a certain format. And so you're making an inquiry of knowledge, and some of it could be your own knowledge. So you can train ChatGPT to read PDFs if you have the plugin. And so, if I'm going to ask ChatGPT a question, I've actually uploaded my own books, and I'll say, hey, you're the author of the New Leadership Playbook, and you're the author of Self-Leadership, How to Become a More Successful, Efficient, and Effective Leader from the Inside Out. How would you approach this? So I'm making ChatGPT me. It's read my book, and then it's actually giving me my own perspectives. And sometimes it does it in a way I went, actually, I have said that, but I've never quite said it that way. And it's just like this interview that we're having right now. You're a great podcast interviewer. You've clearly done your due diligence, and you're asking me questions about stuff I've written. And that is enjoyable because I go, oh, yeah, I did say that. And I'd forgotten. And now I have to back it up and justify it or remember what my process was at the time. And that's what ChatGPT and other AI tools do, is they act as the mirror and they reflect it back and go, when you're putting your makeup on, you go, oh, actually, that's in the wrong place. I need to shift it. And changing the languaging, or just starting with a template rather than starting from a blank sheet of paper. When I'm writing a blog, sometimes I will start with a blank sheet of paper, but sometimes I'll go, okay, ChatGPT, give me everything I know on this topic based on my writings. And then, what is the current cutting edge on this topic? And then I'll sit back and I'll go, okay, now me, Andrew, in real time human, what do I think people need to hear about? And then I will distill that and write the article. So for me, that's an augmentation. Just as a calculator didn't replace mathematics, it just meant I could add up a little bit faster.
That's really interesting. So it's almost like an augment coach that reviews how you write, what you write, and plays it back to you like a mirror.
It does. It's like a mirror, like a tape recorder. If you want to know what you sound like, as a speaker, I don't do it anymore. Actually, maybe I should. I would listen back to my speeches and I could have done that better, or I don't like the way I sound here. And I changed it. I used to just deconstruct every sentence to perfect the craft. There are AI tools that can analyze my speech, and there are AI tools that can actually analyze the audience interaction to that speech. And then I could rewrite it. If you put a video on YouTube, you'll see how long people watched your video for. There are tools that will say, when did they stop in the video, or when did they pause? When did they do these things? And that gives you immediate feedback. So feedback is powerful, and it's having a way to sort through the data and with an intentionality of, I want that feedback because I want to improve in this direction.
Listeners, that might be something you're interested in. So I know we've talked about feedback in terms of getting that feedback from another person, but actually AI is not another person. It's giving your information and what you may have written back to you. And maybe that's a non-threatening way for you to start to seek out feedback and feed forward in a way that doesn't mean that you have to fall out with your friends.
I'm a great believer in any kind of feedback. I'm into biohacking, right? So I'm interested to know, what is my blood cholesterol? What's my blood pressure? If you've got an Apple Watch, it'll tell you what your blood oxygen is and are you in sinus rhythm? And you can stand on a set of smart scales and it says, what's your percentage of body fat versus muscle mass, etc. And I'm interested, how long can I fast for and still exercise? Because if you fast too long and exercise, you're just going to hit the wall because you're not kicking into burning your fat fast enough. And I think all of these things, it's just being curious. What's the best version of me? How much sleep do I need? When am I best focused? And you can use AI to track that. They're already built into your iPhone is, these are your number of focus minutes working. And so get proactive with that. Realize, actually, I'm best to get up from my computer and go and walk around the block, right? And I'm lucky. I live a short drive from the beach. And in the middle of the day, sometimes when I've hit a wall, I am not being productive. I'm fortunate, being my own boss, I can go and have a walk on the beach, come back, and then I might work late into the night. I'm better off that way.
So that's certainly something that you want to think about, listeners, is developing your self-awareness is a whole body thing. So whether you're looking at biohacking or whether you're reflecting on your behavior or whether you're trying to unpick your thoughts and to really give your emotions names, then maybe there is something in AI that can help you do that. Andrew, you've written a couple of books and you have mentioned the New Leadership Playbook. Before you go, tell us a little bit about what listeners expect to read when they're reading the New Leadership Playbook.
The New Leadership Playbook was commissioned by one of my clients, a Silicon Valley software company. During the pandemic, I'd worked with the CEO, the executive leadership team, and the chief people officer said, look, this has been transformational. We want to cascade this down through the organization. Could you write us a book? And we went backwards and forwards around the budget for that, and they didn't have enough money. But I said, look, I'll tell you what, I'll write it for you, but I want to hold on to the IP. And so I've then published it. But what I got from them was, real case studies. And it's called a playbook because it's such an American term. A play in American football, of course, is a set of behaviors. And what I realized about leadership is that leadership is a conversation. It's a conversation one-to-one. It's a conversation one-to-many. And yet only 8% of leaders that we can track, at least on their digital platforms, are having conversations. Everybody's broadcasting. And so I realized that just as people are emotionally illiterate, they're actually conversation illiterate. They don't know how to have the feedback conversation. They don't know how to have the career conversation, the coaching conversation. And so in the New Leadership Playbook, there's my view on leadership. There is what's required for leadership in the future and living in a post-pandemic digital world. And there are 12 conversations, very practical, that can improve your leadership by role modeling out how to have better conversations.
We will make sure that there is a link to Andrew's books in the show notes. Andrew, how can listeners and watchers get in touch with you if they want to know more about self-leadership?
Two best places to find me are the website selfleadership.com. So since self-leadership is the methodology that I've been talking about for 20 plus years. And on there's pretty much links to everything. If you're a LinkedIn person, I'm on LinkedIn and there's lots of my material on LinkedIn. And then that's pushed to Twitter, now X. And you won't find me on TikTok. I just don't dance in 30 seconds. So selfleadership.com or LinkedIn.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And I'm really pleased that we were able to have this conversation at last. Andrew, where are you heading off to next in the world? Where do you fly off to?
Next week, I'm here in Portugal, speaking in Portugal. The week after that, I'm in Barcelona. And the week after that, I'm doing something for counselors as in therapy counselors, not town counselors, in the UK. So in London.
Wow. Wonderful. Well, maybe I will see you in London. Andrew,
okay.
For now, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a really great conversation. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode. Please remember to leave a rate and review on your favourite podcast platform because a little word from you means a big deal to me. You can also sign up for my newsletter on my website, knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk. Join me next week when we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.